Hello and welcome to So Much for Pathos, the show that gives all of Hollywood's presents to charity and expects them to be grateful. I'll be, of course, your detective. So, The Dark Knight. We've got a lot of ground to cover on this one, but first, the case notes. Before Batman Begins was released, plans for a follow-up were already being made, with David Goyer penning 2 treatments for potential sequels. His original plans purportedly involved the Joker scarring Harvey Dent during his trial in the proposed 3rd film, but at some point down the production line this ended up being collapsed into one film, leaving a 3rd open for creative legroom. Given the ending of Batman Begins, the Joker was dead set to appear as a prominent character, but the extent of which was debated when it came time to put together the screenplay. When collaborating on the script with his brother Jonathan, Christopher Nolan opted to deliberately not include an origin story for the character, and instead present him as more of a mercurial figure within the story. Even though Nolan was initially hesitant to return to the director's chair, he almost certainly wanted to put the Joker in the movie. The story of The Dark Knight was intended to very much be an escalation of the first film, drawing significant influence from Heat by Michael Mann, in that the story would be told on a city-wide scale across 3 main characters, creating a larger playing field for a more expansive yet intricately layered story. Nolan also opted for the story to not be compressed and allow the character arcs to be intertwined as the story would progress, as not to eliminate any certain arc for a central primary focus. Harvey Dent was going to be turning into Two-Face in one movie, giving emotional weight to the story, which simply would not have occurred with another character in the story, such as the unsympathetic Joker. The film's production, which began on April of 2007, would make significant use of the 70mm IMAX format, something which Christopher Nolan had been meaning to do for years, resulting in higher image resolution but on the downside meaning heavier cameras and therefore limited mobility with handheld. The Dark Knight saw its worldwide release in July of 2008, where it opened to overwhelmingly positive reviews and several Academy Award nominations to soon follow. Often seen as a landmark achievement in both the superhero genre and blockbuster filmmaking, The Dark Knight is frequently cited as one of the most influential films in recent history and appears time after time on many greatest ever lists on the web. So this will be the one that you've been waiting for us to talk about since we started this whole bloody thing, so let's get on with it, shall we? As previously established, Christopher Nolan's Batman movies deliberately placed themselves as something other than Tim Burton's films and Joel Schumacher's films, but what's interesting to me is that Nolan attempts to place his idea of Batman even further away from what was established in Batman Begins. It's kind of weird. I mean, there's only a 2-year gap between this movie and the last one, and there's very little of The Dark Knight that actually looks and feels like Batman Begins. Fundamentally, The Dark Knight borrows its visual aesthetic from Michael Mann's Heat and its screenplay structure to an extent from Sergio Leone's The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, inasmuch as the movie allows itself a good few minutes at the start to establish the central players before the narrative can begin proper. We're introduced to the Joker with the opening bank heist to establish him as a credible threat. Shortly thereafter, we're reintroduced to Batman as the returning hero, and once we meet Harvey Dent, the game officially starts. The Joker essentially plans to create chaos within Gotham's societal structure by undermining the very pillars of its foundation in the form of its high-ranking criminals being held aloft by the city's corrupt banking system, by destroying its key symbol of hope in the form of Harvey Dent before the public, and by demonstrating the city's own amorality when removed from the comforts of order with that final set piece with the 2 ships. And the only surefire way of stopping the Joker's ultimate plan that the Joker makes reference to is for Batman to demask himself before Gotham and reveal his true self, which creates an interesting dichotomy as Bruce was attempting to quietly retire anyway, free-funding Harvey Dent's political campaign. Structurally, the movie balances itself through its central characters, which the script presents as a symbolic tipping scale. Harvey Dent sits at the very centre as both the best and worst of Gotham, as embodied by his descent from Gotham's White Knight eventually to Two-Face at the end. Batman sits at one side as an all-good authority figure, and the Joker as the polar opposite in the form of an outsider who wishes nothing but wanton destruction on the system that most likely helped shape him. If you're already a comic book fan, particularly of Batman, then it may not surprise you to learn that the plot is in part inspired by Alan Moore's The Killing Joke from 1986, in which the Joker plots to turn Commissioner Gordon insane to prove anyone under the right circumstances can become as distorted as he is, and by extension as fractured as Batman is, implying that the Joker and Batman are not all that dissimilar. In retrospect, Alan Moore has gone on record as saying that he's no longer proud of that particular work, but regardless, the comic has gone on to become a part of the Joker's, at best, shaky origin story, so it's kind of a no-brainer that bits of it show up here. This balancing of the scale seems to be what's at the core of The Dark Knight at a thematic level. One side is interested in anarchy and the other side is interested in maintaining order, and it's this difficult grasp of moral absolutism that makes The Dark Knight both an excellent movie and one that's very highly questionable. As befits a sequel, the main theme is one of escalation. The Dark Knight feels like and presents a bigger movie, even though it ironically has less villains than Batman Begins did, and also has far less moving pieces in terms of the plot. It feels more stripped down and nuanced than the last film, and the 2 main villains present a much more intimidating threat than those in Batman Begins. The Joker and Two-Face aren't foreign powers trying to wreak havoc on our own soul, they're members of our own societal structure, albeit the Joker is almost certainly an outcast, which makes the story a lot more closer to home in terms of the threat presented. Batman's role is that of a guardian for ostensibly everything Gotham's societal structure structure holds dear, and the extent to which Batman goes to uphold those values is where The Dark Knight gets really interesting. Whilst Batman is no longer a man on the outside trying to do good in the only way that he knows how, he's still a vigilante, and has a very shaky relationship with Gotham's law enforcement, Commissioner Gordon acting as a symbolic proxy. He knows that he should arrest Batman due to him being a vigilant force outside the law, but him being a vigilant force outside the law, as well as him being predominantly on their side, means he may prove useful to have hanging around. Once the Joker shows up and spreads anarchy beyond the police's capability of handling, it's only then that Batman is allowed to be an active participant in stopping the carnage. Well, I mean, he was always going to, whether or not the authorities recognised him as an ally, but before then crime fighting was only recognised through Harvey Dent. At this point, Batman basically uses whatever force he deems necessary in the name of good. He is his own jurisdiction.
It's in control.
Throughout the movie, there's an overwhelming tension between what Batman means as a symbol and who Batman is as a person, and whether or not Bruce Wayne can be held responsible for his actions as Batman. That scene in the interrogation room between Batman and the Joker shows how much Gotham PD are willing to allow Batman to get away with in the pursuit of justice, even though the Joker explicitly tells Batman in the same scene that everything he's doing in the name of good in the face of profound evil will be seen as good until society deems him unnecessary. Like, this isn't subtext I'm talking about here, this is explicit text. The ultimate plan the Joker concocts is one that aims to undermine Gotham's value system by questioning the ethics of said value system in the face of an agent of chaos such as himself. Batman is completely complicit in this plan, inasmuch as he ends up committing a series of morally questionable actions in order to stop him. Early on in the movie, during a conversation with Alfred, Bruce tells him that Batman has no limits, but the succeeding 2 hours of the movie show Bruce learning the hard way what those limits are. It's an incredibly powerful sentiment, and one that's not often found in an expensive consumer product such as a superhero-themed summer blockbuster, but falls short because of its own trappings. You see, what I'm getting at here is that I've got no problem with the story as a whole. The characters, or at least the characters most central to the story, all at one point or another end up taking actions that which the morality of is incredibly shaky. My problem comes in the form of the framing. Not the premise at all, the premise is more or less watertight. I mean, it's needlessly overcomplicated, look who we're dealing with here, but relatively speaking, the broad outline of the story is great and leaves a lot of much needed legroom for exploration. But as I said, the problem lies in the framing. In a sense, The Dark Knight suffers from the same problem that Twilight suffered from. Stay with me here. You see, with Twilight, the objection most people raise with it has nothing to do with the premise of a young, impressionable girl having to choose between an overbearing, abusive vampire and a slightly less abusive but still just as overbearing werewolf. The problem is how it's framed. Bella's abusive relationship with her undead stalker is presented as a fairy tale romance. The toxic interactions are accepted positively and at face value rather than examined critically in the form of a satirical or psychological piece. The Dark Knight does some decidedly sketchy things with its protagonist over the course of its 2.5-hour running time, but a majority of the problems lie in the framing. Batman in The Dark Knight, like it or not, crosses a series of huge moral lines in the pursuit of justice. And Batman's actions in that pursuit are always framed in profoundly heroic terms, even when his actions fly in the face of common morality. He hacks into Gotham's cell phone network in order to find the Joker's whereabouts. He locks himself in a room with a terrorist and beats information from him. He kidnaps a man from a location far outside his jurisdiction and turns him over to authorities with the same lack of jurisdiction. And yet the narrative holds Batman ostensibly in the role of the can-do-no-wrong superhero. What would have been far more interesting is if Batman and the rest of the characters were depicted in morally varying shades of grey, a la Heat, but The Dark Knight struggles to place itself outside of the binary yin and yang, black and white morality of the superhero myth. Perhaps in part this is because we, the audience, are victims of protagonist-centred morality, where the viewers align themselves with the goals and aspirations of the central character, regardless of whether or not they should actually be seen as the villain of the piece. This is one of the major incompatibilities between the morally and psychologically realistic filmmaking Nolan is trying to keep to, and comic book heroes as a feature of modern fiction. Heroic and realistic characters cannot comfortably coexist within a narrative, nor can a character easily be written as both. The difference between heroic and realistic treatment of a narrative is one that has been recognised for a long time, and often used to great effect to re-examine a well-known story. Take, for example, the story of Electra. No, not that one. There we go. This was a popular Greek myth related to the Trojan War. According to the legend, after Troy had fallen to the Greeks following a 10-year siege, the Greek king Agamemnon had finally returned home to his wife Clytemnestra, only to have her murder him in his bathtub and continue ruling the kingdom with her new boyfriend. Later, their son and daughter Orestes and Electra get together and murder their mother in turn, in revenge for the murder of their father. Oh, and her boyfriend too, obviously. There are 2 surviving classical Greek plays entitled Electra, which tell the story of Electra and her brother slaying their mother. One was written by Sophocles and the other was by Euripides. Sophocles typically wrote heroic characters, and Euripides wrote far more realistic characters, and the 2 plays which tell the exact same gory story could hardly be more different. Sophocles' Electra and Orestes, the daughter and son of a murdered king and a murderous queen, are brave and bold. You never question whether their intentions are noble. They agonise over the prospect of killing their remaining parent, but believe it to be the only just course. The queen and her paramour are villainous, so you can't feel sorry for them. They've even made sure the gods are on board with what they're doing. There's even a nice old man at the start of the play for Orestes to be a good, respectful Greek boy to.
Big damn hero, sir! Think weak!
In his Electra play retelling the exact same myth, Euripides wrote his characters very differently. The Euripides versions of the siblings Electra and Orestes are cowards. They're constantly afraid. They lie to and are distrustful of each other. The purity of their motives is called into question. Orestes, the prince, stands to gain by overthrowing his mother, and an unsympathetic Electra seems to be more bent on sheer revenge than any divinely ordained justice. Orestes wavers before the final act of matricide. Nevertheless, they lure their own mother into the house and cut her throat, and after the murder they're racked with guilt, the real psychological consequences of this extreme act. You see, the same basic plot has a tremendously different tone depending on how realistic you make the characters, as opposed to heroic. A realistic treatment of a tale normally told in line with a more heroic sensibility serves a purpose if you can use it to re-examine the assumptions of the original, and sometimes you can find new meaning in an old story, but you have to take it the whole way. You can see the problem with applying realism rules to comic book vigilantes, the equivalent of mythic heroes in modern popular culture. Superheroes exist within an inherently unrealistic moral universe which allows them to be goodies standing up to the baddies, admirable if extreme figures. Real vigilantes exist where law and order is breaking down, but are very rarely principled, corrupt by definition since they have no oversight, normally mentally ill, and actually worsen the decay of their society by encouraging a culture wherein official law enforcement and the judiciary are sidelined. In a realistic universe, Batman undermines the role of the police by his very existence. The clash between heroic and realistic logic is exemplified by the Bat Vigilante scene. A meeting between mobsters is ambushed by armed vigilantes dressed as Batman, inspired by his actions to go out and take law into their own hands. They make a glorious mess for a while before Batman shows up and kicks ass. But he finds himself angry at the Bat Vigilantes and ties them up as well.
Don't let me find you out here again.
We're trying to help you!
I don't need help!
Wait, so why is he angry? Well, it's not because he's concerned for the vigilante's safety. He leaves them tied up ready to be captured if the police turn up or if the Chechen comes back for his dogs. Is it because the vigilantes are irresponsible and put the lives and property of ordinary Gotham citizens at risk? Well, no, they're attacking in a quiet car park at night, and it's not like they cause more collateral property damage than Batman with his intimidation rockets. Is it because they use guns? Well, again, no. Begins never had a moment where Batman swears off using firearms as in the comics, and after all, he himself has no trouble using bike-mounted miniguns later on in the same actual fucking movie. The thing is, we know why he's angry. It's the same reason why we, the audience, despise them instinctively. They're imposters, usurpers. They're not the real Batman. They're just normal people. And Batman is something else. Something above. The thing is, this is mythic thinking. We assign Batman a role that we would never entrust to an actual human being in real life because he's the hero. This scene is, in of itself, a fine example of how a realist reimagining of an old story can serve a purpose, as it adequately demonstrates and provokes us to question our implicit and often uncritical trust of the hero in a heroic narrative. The trouble is, Christopher Nolan struggles to follow through with this idea.
What gives you the right? What's the difference between you and me?
I'm not wearing hockey pads.
The Vigilante asks the most important question regarding the morality of a character like Batman, and Batman can't really give an answer beyond "I'm a billionaire and can buy more expensive crime-fighting pants than you." This wouldn't necessarily be a problem if the question had payoff over the course of the rest of the film. As much as anything, the film needed to explore what made Batman different from ordinary Gotham citizens, what entitled him to place himself above the law, and if he is not entitled to do so, how we, the audience, should respond to such a morally grey protagonist. Hell, it isn't as if questioning the motives and authority of a superhero is new.
You didn't come here for forgiveness. You want permission, and I can't give you that, son.
Justice isn't a sin, Father.
No, but vengeance is.
Batman loses the acceptance of Gotham citizens at the end of the film, not because everyone realises that he has no right to torture people with impunity, but rather because he allows himself to be framed. But knowing he is innocent of dense homicide, if little else, we the audience are encouraged to keep him on his heroic bat pedestal. So ultimately the only answer we have to this question is because he's Batman. So he just is different from us. The question has no payoff. Ultimately Nolan and Goya slips back into the comforting certainties of superhero mythos and hopes we would forget that they had previously questioned those same certainties. We go from this, well-meaning thugs asking what makes Batman different from a well-meaning thug in a mask, to this, an end sequence where Gordon essentially talks about Batman as if he's goth Jesus, and we have to accept that this happens in the same film. This is doubly problematic because the only argument the film really makes for Batman's superior entitlement to break the law is that glib comeback. In the same scene, Batman is juxtaposed with vigilantes not by his attitude or scruples, but by his superior resources, with this being trumped by this. Indeed, Batman succeeds in the film substantially through perching victory, to his skyhook, to his vehicles, to his magic phone vision. He can buy things the rest of us can't. If Bruce Wayne is justified in acting as Batman simply by virtue of being the only man in Gotham with the wealth to be Batman, then the audience assumption of the morality of his actions ultimately rests on a might makes right argument. Wayne has the financial special might, thus he has the right. Here's the thing. If the purpose of a superhero is to maintain or establish order, then functionally superheroes are by their very nature inherently fascistic. Batman, as the Dark Knight sees him, is absolutely a figure of the status quo. He's become a governing figure that somewhat replaces Carmine Falcone from the last film. Falcone got to be where he was because he led a campaign of corruption predicated on fear. Batman replaces him on the same fear principle but aims squarely towards those who corrupted the system in the first place. It's important to note that seemingly the only surefire way of stopping the Joker's scheme is for Batman to take his mask off. Why issue that demand? Because by taking his mask off, Batman reveals himself to be another one of us. Another person. At least in theory anyway, Bruce Wayne is still a member of the 1% and all. In case you think I'm reaching too far with this fascism angle, think about what Dent says about Batman over dinner.
When their enemies were at the gates, the Romans would suspend democracy and appoint one man to protect the city. And it wasn't considered an honor, it was considered a public service.
The gist of this conversation is to argue that democracy and accountable public officials are weak, and that in a real crisis it's justifiable to suspend free society and appoint a dictator to solve our problems for us as he sees fit. Again, I'm not reaching here. The men the Romans appointed as temporary kings in times of extremity were literally called dictatores. Rachel does sort of challenge this argument that casually strikes to the heart of every liberal ideal, but only to point out a potential pitfall of appointing a glorious overlord with no checks on his power, that they don't always respect term limits.
Harvey, the last man that they appointed to protect the Republic was named Caesar, and he never gave up his power.
Honestly, the least of the problems there are with a dictator. The thing is, once you start having dictators, you tend to keep having them, democracy rapidly becoming in the public consciousness an idealist pipe dream that is never quite safe enough to return to. Even if you get to chuck a dictator out at the end of the year, what difference does it make if a new dictator inevitably replaces them? You might even have 3 de facto dictators with all important roles stitched between them, taking it in turns to be on top. That's what we would call a triumvirate, another little something from Roman history which Mr. Dent may have heard of and which didn't turn out too well. You see, the 2 triumvirates were the last dictators of the Roman Republic. The first ended, yes, in the ascendancy, solo dictatorship and then gruesome death of Caesar. The second resulted in the final dismantling of Roman senatorial power and the effective foundation of the empire, ensuring that Rome would forever be ruled by a combination of tyrannical warlords and their idiot stepchildren. Now, before you all line up to stand outside my house and contemplate which window to break first, I'm not saying Nolan is in any way a fascist. In fact, I put money on this passage being in the film precisely because Nolan himself is starting to find his incarnation of Batman philosophically troubling and is trying to ask very important questions about the character. But if you, as the filmmakers, ask what makes a potentially fascistic character different from a dictator but never provide any payoff in terms of demonstrating how he isn't, you only really end up making things worse. So ultimately the script is neither dumb enough nor quite smart enough for us to either ignore or accept the troubling implications of Batman's actions. Again, just to be clear, I'm not saying The Dark Knight is a bad movie because it's got things in it that I disagree with politically, but as Roger Ebert once said, it's not what a movie's about, it's how it goes about it. And regardless of the overall quality of the piece, this is The Dark Knight's single greatest failing as a piece of art. It talks at great length about the difficulty of upholding the law and common good under the threat of chaos and destruction, but through inaction it frames itself as apolitical, made worse by the fact that we're never given many opportunities to see Batman, or Bruce Wayne specifically, struggle with the consequences of his actions. There's a moment where Bruce tells Rachel that he's fully aware of what kind of person he'd have to become to stop people like the Joker, and therefore Harvey should be the one to take over protecting the city, but once Harvey sinks to the depths of villainhood, Batman immediately goes back to doing his usual shtick and all bets are off. Equally, just after Harvey gets blown half to hell by the Joker because Batman failed to save him and Bruce is given a moment to contemplate what he's done, Alfred follows up his Burma story by telling Bruce that they eventually found the jewel thief by burning the forest down, with the tacit implication that Batman needs to do the same with the overwhelming Joker problem. This is one of the reasons why critics harsher than I have described The Dark Knight as some kind of vaguely supportive allegory for the Patriot Act. And the thing is, you can dismiss all of this by saying, well, it's just a movie, it's just meant to be entertainment, but that argument is flawed when you consider the serious intent of the aesthetic and overall tone. Nolan is presenting these issues to us and we're intended to debate the merits of these things philosophically. This becomes particularly apparent when you realise that across all 3 Christopher Nolan Batman movies there's surprisingly little action, and instead he aims to engage with the philosophical underpinnings that drive these movies. If the question is The Dark Knight a bad movie because Batman does all the things that he does in it, I certainly wouldn't say the answer is no, but I think it's particularly telling that Batman's most devoted fans don't seem to want the question asked. It's a particularly modern phenomenon that young people these days seem to be especially self-conscious of what they consider a worthwhile way to spend their time, and therefore want their favourite things to be taken seriously, but not seriously enough to lead to discussions about some of the more troubling aspects of things like The Dark Knight that are for me the most interesting parts about the movie, at least from a discussion standpoint. Fans will be willing to admit that Batman's actions are ethically sketchy, but never seem to allow that thought to go any further, which is why it's interesting to me that people often find themselves talking about The Dark Knight as if the movie was by default apolitical. If you're interested in a much broader conversation about the political nature of all things pop culture, I highly recommend Slavoj Žižek's documentary A Pervert's Guide to Ideology. But anyway, back to The Dark Knight. So the last time we saw Batman in Batman Begins, we saw Batman, well, begin as he rises to overturn and disempower the corrupt status quo. But now in The Dark Knight, Bruce finds himself accepted, relatively speaking, amongst said status quo, still in the middle of fighting the remains of corruption with the help of Gotham's District Attorney Harvey Dent. Arguably, you could say the Joker is attempting to overturn the city's corruption in the same way that Batman did in the last film, but on his own destructive and villainous terms. If that's so, then what exactly is the difference between this single-minded idealist in a cape and this single-minded idealist in clown makeup?
What gives you the right? What's the difference between you and me?
I'm not wearing hockey pads.
Well, that and you're a billionaire corporate princeling with more money than God, but your excuse is as good as mine. Actually, let's allow ourselves to segue into talking about the Joker. Now, I'm not too interested in talking about Heath Ledger's performance in itself. A lot of excellent stuff has been said about it in the past, and I do ultimately feel that Ledger's tragic passing has long overshadowed the character in a way that's unshakable for new actors coming to the role, especially now that there's Jared Leto coming fairly soon down the line. So instead, let's talk about who this particular Joker is and what he is designed to represent, being, as he is, one of the many incarnations of the Joker character we've seen over the years. The Joker in The Dark Knight says as much himself that he is very much an agent of chaos, a mad outside force of influence in the same way that Batman is for the establishment. He's what we in the nerd community refer to as chaotic evil on the spectrum of character alignments we probably shouldn't give too much of a shit about. Borrowing influence in his makeup from Francis Bacon, a painter who specialised in a series of random splashes of colour that inadvertently end up creating an image without the intent of creating one, we find ourselves with a surprisingly apt way of describing this version of the Joker. He's a guy with no concrete plans, instead he only has a series of chaotic ideas that inadvertently create one. He acknowledges that the current societal plan is bullshit and aims to change it irrevocably by blowing it sky high. That's as close to an overarching plan as the Joker gets. His entire character mostly reminds me of that wonderful Anarchy Wears Two Faces speech from the comic version of V for Vendetta. Even though it's been parodied a billion times, there's a reason why his everyone loses their mind speech has now become a meme. This is where we return to the Killing Joke plot-wise. The Joker's main focus towards the end of the second act is dethroning Dent as Gotham's White Knight by blowing him up and recreating him in his own image. The staging of said dethroning is quite interesting. The death of a loved one dying before his eyes, okay, before his ears, which sets him full of rage before receiving a talking to from an influential figure in the plot which sets him on a vigilante spree across the city. Now where have I heard that story before? It's Batman Begins again, except reframed as the villain story with the Joker filling in for the Liam Neeson role, thus creating a direct parallel between Batman, the Joker, and now Two-Face. All three are permutations on the same type of origin story. The same rules of conception that created Batman are the same rules that apply to the Joker and Two-Face. This, in a nutshell, is basically the entire crux of the damaged and problematic nature of Gotham's societal structure that Batman is trying to maintain and the Joker is trying to destroy. Alan Moore said the reason why he didn't like the dualism he included in The Killing Joke is because having that dualism pointed out to the audience does them no favours, but with The Dark Knight they've actually taken the gem of that idea and actually done something amazingly elegant with it. And then comes the climax, the grand set piece to finish off the movie and the final step in the Joker's madcap scheme. So you've got these two ships, one full of civilians and the other is full of prison guards and prisoners. There's a bomb on both ships and the Joker tells both of them that one has to blow the other up before midnight strikes or both of them blow up in a kind of psychopathically twisted version of something Stanley Milgram would throw together. At this point, Two-Face is on the loose, but Batman doesn't know about it yet and is instead focusing on trying to find the Joker's whereabouts. He achieves this by hacking into Gotham's cell phone network and tracking his voice. Yeah, never mind that set piece with the ships. Batman outright abuses civil liberties in order to find a terrorist. Lucius Fox is the one who raises the question of ethics when Batman reveals this and tells Batman that as long as the machine is functional then he'll be gone, but this is kind of sort of brushed aside as being okay. Like, it's totally okay for Batman to do this because all other means of law enforcement have been exhausted, at least according to Batman. After Batman locates the Joker, he storms the building, eliminating a SWAT team that gets in his way, and meets the Joker at the top where they make their final encounter in the form of a fistfight. The Joker's plan goes awry when neither ship is willing to blow the other up in a sign that perhaps the city is a lot more morally sound than the Joker had predicted, but the Joker reveals that he had one final ace up his sleeve the whole time. Two-Face. Whilst Batman was hunting down the Joker, Two-Face was on the loose taking revenge for those who allowed him to fall by rattling the Joker's cage. The final moments see what I would consider the real final moral set piece of the film, in which Two-Face, Commissioner Gordon and Batman confront each other for the last time, owning up to their sins and questioning what constitutes justice in an unfair society as the Joker had intended. Two-Face gets killed inadvertently and Batman and Gordon are left with a conundrum. If anyone were to see what happened to Gotham's symbol of hope, everything Gotham's infrastructure had been working towards would collapse, thus proving the Joker correct.
People will lose hope.
They won't. They must never know what he did.
5 dead. 2 of them cops. You can't speak that.
But the Joker cannot win.
And so the two decide to bury the truth about Harvey, telling the public instead that Batman was responsible for Harvey's crimes, as Batman rides off into retirement with the police behind him in hot pursuit. But here's the thing, by having Batman take the rap for the murders that Harvey committed and having the police now turned on Batman, it ultimately proves the Joker still right, in that Batman is now outcasted by the society he helped police. He, in the words of the Joker, is now deemed unnecessary. Batman's actions are no longer righteous now that the threat is over, and he is yet to answer for said actions. It's a bold and philosophically powerful ending that throws everything we've seen over the entirety of the narrative up in the air for debate, punctuated by a question mark in the form of Commissioner Gordon's final words.
Because he's the hero Gotham deserves, but not the one it needs right now. So we'll hunt him. Because he can take it. Because he's not our hero. He's a silent guardian, a watchful protector, a dark knight.
That's the main sticking point that Nolan is choosing to leave us with at the end. Considering everything that Batman has done and all that he's responsible for, including the wake of supervillains that sprung up in his presence, does Gotham need, or did it ever need, a Batman? It's true that Batman has the potential for tremendous good for the benefit of society, as his initial ambitions were and remain eradicating crime and corruption as depicted in Batman Begins. But it's also true that the stream of chaotic supervillains that came up after his arrival were almost certainly his fault. Batman is as much a cure of the system he inhabits as he is a symptom of it. In his quest to destroy the system that created Joe Chill that in turn created Batman, he has in his wake created a more fragmented version of Gotham's former self, such as the duality of Batman. As a figure standing proudly over the city, acting as a self-appointed watchful guardian, he can almost certainly be defined as the hero Gotham deserves, a Gotham that allowed itself to fall into the depths of corruption that it did. But Batman is not bound by this definition. He is a figure that can help reshape the system, but only from the outside, only from a relative distance, such is the nature of superheroes. A superhero is inherently fascistic, yes, but ultimately we invented superheroes for a purpose. We invented them as beacons of hope, we invented them as symbols of great achievement, we invented them as figures of protection when we needed protection most. We invented them as keys to vestiges of the human imagination to witness great acts performed that cannot be achieved. And if that's so, then what does that say about the human capacity to hand over our agency to figures we allow to stand tall for when we can't? This question is one that I leave with you. Are the heroes we've invented the ones that we need? Going back and revisiting The Dark Knight has ultimately been cathartic. It still remains an excellent movie overall and is more or less unmatched as a piece of well-crafted entertainment, but its respectable ambition is the main key to its biggest flaw. It tries to break the conventions of the superhero myth by recontextualising the ethics thereof, but in the long run ends up still remaining trapped by those conventions all the same. Perhaps this movie is what's solely responsible for the rebooting and darkifying of pop culture properties, but those were made by fucking idiots who had a very slender grasp of tone and nuance. When Watchmen landed in the 1980s, the entire comics industry went to shit, and I imagine The Dark Knight as a cultural touchstone functions in a similar way. There's still a lot of positives here. The cinematography and action set pieces, despite how little of them there are the best they've ever been. The performances are universally the best a Batman movie has ever had, period, including a stellar supporting cast surrounding them. But the mainest of the problems are largely to do with the script, and whilst it doesn't exactly sink the film, it does cripple my ability somewhat to see The Dark Knight with the rose-tinted glasses I used to, and suspect a lot of people still do see it with. With a couple of rewrites, The Dark Knight would have had the potential to be something akin to Starship Troopers, i.e. a satirical critique of militaristic totalitarianism disguised as the real thing, although based on a book which is actually a full endorsement of such values by its initial creator. But I don't see satire in The Dark Knight, nor do I even really see criticism. What I do see, however, is something of a miscalculation. The Dark Knight is a good movie. I enjoyed the hell out of it, and I expect you will too, but it's far from the heralding of the Starborn ones that many of us thought it was, and its philosophical underpinnings, no matter how poignant on paper, are lost under the baggage of the source material and of the tropes of its own genre. It could have been far superior, but I'm thankful enough in this creative economy that it got made at all. And yes, before you ask, I expect you all to be standing outside my house waiting to take it in turns to punch me in the balls, but on that note I must call it case closed. Next time we'll be talking about Inception, but on that note, I'm Matt Crowley, and that was The Dark Knight.